The message arrived at 3:47 station time, and it woke up everyone on Alara 7. Captain Rene Vasquez was already on the bridge of the patrol frigate Perseverance when the transmission hit. Every screen, every speaker, and every personal device on the orbital station. It was not a request, it was not a greeting, it was a single sentence, repeated in 400 galactic languages, broadcast on every frequency the station could receive, submit, serve, or be rendered to ash. Vasquez stood very still. She was a small woman with dark eyes and short, cropped hair, and she had spent 22 years in the United Earth Navy without ever hearing a threat like that. She had dealt with pirates, she had handled border disputes. She had once talked down a drunk freighter captain who tried to ram fuel depot. But this was different, and this was not a negotiation, this was an announcement. "Where is it coming from?" she asked. Her censor officer, a young man named Park, was already working. His hands moved fast across his console, and when he looked up, his face was pale. "Captain, I'm reading over 300 warships. At the edge of the system, they dropped out of FTL about 6 minutes ago. Transmission is coming from all of them at once. 300 warships. Vasquez had 1 frigate, 2 patrol boats, and a station that was built for mining coordination, not war." She did the math in her head and did not like the answer. "Identify them," she said. "Deadliest. Dominion, Captain. The ship's signatures match their conquest fleet configuration." The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew the name. The Deadliest. Dominion was one of the largest military empires in the galaxy. They were insectoids, tall and armored, with mandibles that could cut through steel, and a civilization built entirely on conquest. They had subjugated over 200 species across 3 galactic sectors. Their method was simple. They arrived, they demanded surrender, and if surrender did not come, they destroyed everything and started over with the rubble. No species had ever successfully resisted them. Not one. Vasquez took a slow breath. She looked out the bridge viewport at the stars beyond Alara 7's orbital ring. Somewhere out there, past the asteroid belt and the outer planets, 300 warships were waiting for an answer. She pressed the comm button on her chair. "All hands, this is Captain Vasquez. We are going to general quarters. This is not a drill. I want all civilian transports loaded and launched within 90 minutes. Every man, woman, and child on this station is leaving now." She paused and then she added, "Move fast, people, we don't have much time." The evacuation of Alara 7 was chaos. But it was organized chaos. Humanity had learned a long time ago how to run from danger quickly. The colonists moved with purpose. Parents carried children. Workers grabbed emergency bags that they had packed months ago and never expected to use. The transport ships filled one by one, and one by one they launched toward the inner system, toward the relay gate that would take them back to safer space. While the evacuation ran, Vasquez recorded every detail of the Deadliest fleet and transmitted it back to Earth. She sent the sensor data, the fleet composition, the exact wording of the threat, and a personal note to the Admiralty that read simply, "They are not bluffing, recommend immediate strategic response." Then she waited. The Deadliest did not wait long. When no answer came to their demand within the first hour, they sent A second message, this one was shorter. You have chosen Ash. The first volley hit the orbital station. At 5:12, Vasquez had pulled the Perseverance back to cover the last transport ships, and she watched the station break apart on her sensors. The Deadliest weapons were powerful, precise, and utterly without mercy. The station had been home to almost 8,000 people. Most of them had made it to the transports, almost 6,000 had not. Vasquez felt the number settle into her, just like a stone. She did not cry, she did not scream. She filed it away in the place where soldiers kept the things that would keep them awake for the rest of their lives. And she focused on getting the surviving transports through the relay gate. The Perseverance took fire during the retreat. A Deadliest destroyer clipped them with a beam that tore through the lower decks and killed 9 crew members. Vasquez held the ship together with sheer stubbornness, and they limped through the gate with hull breaches on 3 decks and fire suppression running. On backup power, they made it barely 12 light-years away on Earth. The news arrived like a punch to the stomach. Ambassador Idris Akhefer was eating breakfast in his apartment in Geneva when his communicator buzzed with a priority alert. He read the report twice. He sat down his coffee. He sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the Galactic Concord Embassy building without saying a word to anyone. The Galactic Concord was the closest thing the galaxy had to a government. It was a loose coalition of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations, and it operated on the principle that talking was better than shooting. It had rules, it had courts, and it had a long history of resolving disputes between species through negotiation and compromise. Akhefer had been Earth's ambassador to the Concord for 11 years. He was a tall, calm man with gray at his temples and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when he was furious. He entered the Concord chamber that morning and requested an emergency session. He got one. The chamber was vast, filled with representatives of hundreds of species. Some were tall and thin, some were short and wide, some floated in liquid tanks, and some existed as projected holograms from ships in orbit. Akhefer stood at the speaking platform and laid out the facts. Alara 7, 6,000 dead. An unprovoked attack by the Deadliest Dominion on a civilian station. He requested mediation, peacekeeping forces, and formal condemnation. Response was not what he hoped for. The elder species in the Concord listened politely. Some expressed sympathy, a few offered condolences. But when it came to action, the answer was the same from nearly everyone. The Deadliest Dominion is beyond the scope of Concord intervention, said the Velasi representative, a being that looked like a walking coral reef. He advised the human delegation to consider the practical realities of their situation. Practical realities, Akhefer repeated. The Dominion has conquered over 200 species. Their military capability is beyond anything your civilization can match. Resistance is not a viable strategy. We suggest you negotiate terms of vassalage. The Deadliest are harsh masters, but survival is preferable to extinction. Other species nodded. Some did not even bother to speak. They had seen this before. A small species picked a fight with a big one, or more often, a big one picked a fight with a small one, and they Small one disappeared from the galactic map within a generation. It was sad. It was also, in their view, inevitable. Akefer stood at the platform and looked out at the chamber. 4,000 civilizations tending, and not one of them was willing to help. He was not surprised. He was, however, quietly and thoroughly angry. He leaned forward slightly and spoke into the microphone. "We appreciate the council," he said. His voice was calm and even. "Humanity will handle this internally." He stepped down from the platform and walked out of the chamber. Behind him, a few delegates exchanged puzzled looks. Most did not bother. The humans would surrender within a month, they assumed. Everyone always did. Back on Earth, the governments of the world convened. It was the fastest unified response in human history. The attack on Alara 7 had killed people from 37 different nations, the dead included miners from Brazil, engineers from Japan, teachers from Nigeria, doctors from Norway, Arison's children who had been born on the station and had never seen Earth's sky. The debate was short. The vote was unanimous. War, the United Earth Military Command began mobilization. Within hours, factories that had been building civilian ships switched to warship production. Research labs that had been studying alien technology for decades were given unlimited funding and a single instruction: make weapons. Recruitment offices opened on every continent and were flooded before the doors finished opening. Humanity did not panic. Humanity got angry. There was a difference, and it was a difference the Deadliest did not understand. Far away in the command chamber of the Dominion flagship, Overlord Kethavan received a report from his intelligence division. It was a cultural assessment of the species they had just attacked. Dick. The report was short. It described the humans as a young, fragmented, technologically inferior civilization with no significant military capability. It recommended continued standard conquest protocols. Kethavan glanced at the report. He did not read it. He had conquered dozens of species and they were all the same in the end. They resisted for a little while and then they broke. The humans would be no different. He set the report aside and turned his attention to the logistics of moving his fleet deeper into human space. There were more worlds to take, more resources to claim, more species to bring under the Dominion's control. The humans were a minor nuisance. They would learn their place soon enough. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, historically, permanently wrong, but he did not know that yet. And then by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late. In the first 90 days of the war, humanity lost 5 star systems. The Deadliest moved like a wave. Their fleets were massive, disciplined, and built for one purpose: to crush everything in front of them and keep moving. They took the colony at Bridgewater in 6 hours. They took the mining outpost at Kessler's Drift. 3. They rolled through the farming world of New Cambria in a single afternoon, burning the fields and cracking the domes that kept the air inside. From the outside it looked like the war was already over. The galactic conquered watched the reports come in with a tired familiarity of a species that had seen the story 100 times before. Small civilization picks a fight, big civilization crushes them. The galaxy moves on. Several conquered diplomats quietly began drafting proposals for how to redistribute human colonial assets after the inevitable Surrender, but surrender did not come. And something strange began happening on the worlds the Deadliest had conquered. On Bridgewater, 3 days after the Deadliest garrison settled in, a water treatment plant exploded. The blast killed 47 Deadliest soldiers and poisoned the water supply for the entire eastern district. Deadliest engineers traced the explosion to a chemical reaction triggered by a timer made from a kitchen clock and 2 wires. It had been built by a retired plumber named George Harlan, who was 63 years old and had never held a weapon in his life. On Kessler's Drift, the Deadliest communications array went dark every night at exactly midnight. Every night their technicians would fix it. Every night it would go dark again. It took them 2 weeks to discover that a 12-year-old girl named Sophia Reyes was crawling through the ventilation shafts of the mining complex and pulling the same cable out of the same junction box. They sealed the shafts. She found another way in. They sealed that too. She started cutting the cable from outside in a vacuum suit she had stolen from a dead miner's locker. On New Cambria, the Deadliest burned the fields, so the farmers poisoned the wells. They poisoned them with chemicals that were harmless to humans but devastating to Deadliest biology. It took the Deadliest Medical Corps a month to figure out why their soldiers kept dying, and by then 60% of the garrison was sick. The Deadliest had conquered over 200 species, and none of them had done this. When a species was conquered, they submitted. They went quiet. They accepted their new rulers and tried to survive under the new order. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The humans did not get the message. On the colony world of Threshold, the situation was even worse for the Deadliest. Threshold was a mountainous world with deep valleys and thick forests, and the human colonists there had refused to evacuate. When the Deadliest landed, they expected a quick occupation. What they got was a nightmare. Sergeant Mateo Herrera, who everyone called Brick because he was built like one, led a squad of 14 Marines in the defense of a mountain pass called the Widow's Gate. It was the only ground route to the colony's main settlement, and Herrera had been ordered to hold it for 24 hours, while civilians escaped through the back valleys. He held it for 11 days. His squad planted mines made from industrial explosives and scrap metal. They set tripwires across the pass that triggered rock slides. They rigged speakers to play the sounds of human voices from empty positions, drawing Deadliest fire toward rocks while the real squad fired from behind. They set fires in the forest below the pass to create smoke that blinded Deadliest thermal sensors. When they ran out of mines, they rolled boulders down the slopes by hand. When they ran out of ammunition, they used crossbows made from vehicle suspension springs. When 2 of his Marines were wounded too badly to fire weapons, Herrera had them load magazines and sharpen sticks to jam into Deadliest leg joints. The Deadliest sent a full battalion up the pass. They lost 200 soldiers in 2 days. They sent another battalion. They lost another 100. The pass was narrow, the terrain was brutal, and every single rock seemed to hide something that would kill them. On the 8th day, a Deadliest field commander sent a message to Herrera's position demanding his surrender in exchange for safe passage. Herrera's reply was a single word, and it was not polite. When the 11 days were over and reinforcements finally arrived, Herrera walked down from the pass with 6 surviving Marines, all of them wounded, all of them on their feet. Behind them, the pass was choked with Deadliest dead. The number was later counted at 412. Herrera sat down on a rock, accepted a canteen of water and said, "Tusk, I need more crossbow bolts, 12,000 light years away in a university laboratory on a conquered world called Tessera." A xenoanthropologist named Tylenori was watching all of this with growing horror. Tylenori was a member of the Valesi, the coral-like species whose representative had told Ambassador Akefer to surrender. Tylenori was a scholar, not a diplomat. He studied species, he studied their behavior, their biology, their cultures, and their histories. And something about the humans was wrong. Not wrong as in broken, wrong as in impossible. Every model of interspecies conflict predicted that a civilization as young and small as humanity would collapse within 30 days of facing the Dralax. The models accounted for military strength, economic resources, population size, and technological level. By every measure, the war should have been over before it started. The models did not account for what Tylenori was seeing. He began digging into humanity's history, accessing every database and archive he could reach. What he found made him stop eating for 2 days. Humans, he discovered, were predators, not ambush predators, not pack hunters in the traditional sense. They were something far worse. They were persistent predators. Their ancestors on Earth had hunted by chasing their prey over long distances. Not faster than the animal, but longer. They would follow a creature for hours, sometimes days, never stopping, never resting, until the animal simply collapsed from exhaustion and heat. The human would walk up to it and kill it. They did not win by being stronger. They won by never, ever stopping. Tylenori kept reading. He found the history of their wars, and that was where the real horror began. Humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded history, thousands of years of conflict, millions of dead, over and over and over again. They had fought wars over land, over religion, over ideas, over resources, and sometimes for reasons so complicated that even they could not fully explain them. They had invented weapons that could destroy their entire planet. They had built those weapons, pointed them at each other, and then somehow decided not to use them, but they kept them ready, just in case. They had a concept they called total war. It meant that when pushed far enough, they did not just send soldiers, they sent everyone. Factories became weapons plants, farmers became soldiers, scientists became bomb makers, children carried messages, old women hid ammunition in their kitchens. The entire civilization became a single weapon aimed at the enemy. No other species in the conquered records had anything like this. When other species fought, they fought with their military. When humans fought, they fought with everything they had and everything they were. Tylenori sat in his lab surrounded by screens full of human history and felt something he had never felt before. It was a cold, creeping realization that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake, not the humans. The galaxy. Everyone had looked at humanity and seen a small, young, weak species that would be easy to ignore. Nobody had looked closely enough to see what was underneath. Meanwhile, in a quiet room on Earth, General Yuki Tanaka was staring at a Wall covered in maps, Ms. Tanaka was the chief strategist of the United Earth Military Command, and she had not panicked when the first colonies fell. She had not panicked when the second wave of systems was taken. She had not panicked at all, and this was making her staff very nervous because people who did not panic during disasters were either very brave or very dangerous, and Tanaka was both. She was watching the Deadliest advance, and she was learning. Every colony that fell sent back data. Before it went dark, fleet movements, weapon signatures, shield frequencies, communication protocols, command patterns. The Deadliest did not know it, but every world they conquered was teaching Tanaka how to beat them. She was trading space for information, and the price was terrible, and she paid it because the alternative was worse. She stood in front of her wall of maps and moved pins and drew lines and ran calculations, and slowly, piece by piece, a plan took shape. It was not a kind plan. It was not a gentle plan. It was the plan of a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and the invention of nuclear weapons. And it was built on a simple truth that the Deadliest had not yet figured out. Humans did not fight wars to survive. They fought wars to win, and there was a very big difference. On the far side of the galaxy, Tilnari finished his research and did something unusual. He sent an unsolicited message directly to the Deadliest Dominion's intelligence division. It was not his place to do so. It violated half a dozen conquered protocols. He sent it anyway because he was scared, and he thought someone should know. The message was short. It only read, "You have made a profound miscalculation. These beings do not surrender. They do not forget, and they have only been buying time." Deadliest intelligence officer who received the message read it, marked it as irrelevant, and deleted it. In the mountain passes of Threshold, Sergeant Herrera was already teaching the local civilians how to build crossbows from vehicle parts. On the burned fields of New Cambria, farmers were mixing a new batch of poison, this one designed to seep through Deadliest armor. Seals on Bridgewater, a retired plumber's granddaughter, was building her first bomb, and on Earth General Tanaka looked at her maps, and for the first time in 90 days she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a species that had finally finished learning and was ready to start teaching. On the 91st day of the war, humanity stopped retreating. There was no announcement, no grand speech, no dramatic moment where a flag was raised and trumpets played. There was simply a shift, as quiet and as deadly as a knife being drawn in a dark room. One day the Deadliest were advancing, and the next day they were not, and then the day after that they were dying. General Yuki Tanaka called it the Tanaka Doctrine, though she did not name it herself. Her staff did, because they needed a name for what she had planned, and the plan needed a name because it was the kind of thing that people would either study in military academies for centuries or condemn as madness. Possibly both. The doctrine was built on one simple idea: do not fight the Deadliest the way the Deadliest expect to be fought. The Deadliest understood war as a thing of fleets and formations. They lined up their ships, pointed them at the enemy, and pushed forward with overwhelming firepower. It was how they had beaten every species they had ever fought. Their ships were bigger, their weapons were stronger, and their numbers were greater. Any enemy that tried to match them ship for ship would lose. This was a mathematical certainty. Tanaka did not intend to match them ship for ship. The first sign that something had changed came at a Deadliest supply depot. In the Korath system, the depot was deep behind Deadliest lines, far from any active front, protected by a garrison of 30 warships. It held fuel, ammunition, and food for an entire sector fleet. It was considered completely safe. At 4:00 local time, a 12 human frigates dropped out of FTL inside the depot's defensive perimeter. They appeared without warning, moving at attack speed, and they opened fire before the Deadliest garrison could raise shields. The frigates hit the fuel storage first, then the ammunition bunkers, then the food warehouses. The entire depot was burning within 8 minutes. The frigates turned and jumped back to FTL before the garrison ships could form a firing line. Total Deadliest losses: 1 supply depot, 4 warships, and 6 months of stockpiled resources. Total human losses: 1 frigate damaged, 0 destroyed. The same thing happened at 3 other depots that night, and the night after. And the night after that. The Deadliest had never faced hit-and-run tactics at this scale. Their own military doctrine did not include a concept for it. When they fought in lines and formations in grand fleet actions where strength decided the outcome, and GT clears throat, and GT, the idea of an enemy appearing from nowhere, striking a single target and vanishing before a response could be organized, was not just unfamiliar to them, it was offensive. It was the behavior of vermin, not warriors. They called it cowardice. Tanaka called it winning. But the supply raids were only the beginning. On the occupied worlds, the resistance that had been simmering for 90 days erupted into full-scale warfare. It was not the organized military resistance of soldiers with uniforms and ranks. It was something much worse. It was the resistance of an entire species that had decided, individually and collectively, that they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. On Bridgewater and the Resistance, fighters began broadcasting Deadliest casualty numbers on the Dominion's own communication channels. Every morning, the Deadliest garrison would turn on their comms and hear a calm human voice reading a list of names. Not human names, Deadliest names, the names of every Deadliest soldier killed the day before, read slowly and clearly with the time and location of their death. The psychological effect was devastating. The Deadliest were a hive-adjacent species. They felt the loss of their own deeply, hearing their dead named, one by the very creatures who had killed them, shook them in ways that no weapon could. On threshold, Sergeant Herrera and his growing army of civilian fighters took the offensive. They came out of the mountains at night, hitting Deadliest patrols, supply convoys, and communication relays, and they never attacked the same way twice. One night it was explosives, the next it was pit traps. The night after that they diverted a river into a Deadliest underground bunker and drowned everyone inside. On New Cambria, farmers discovered that Deadliest armor seals were vulnerable to a specific acid compound that could be made from common agricultural chemicals. They loaded it into crop spraying drones and flew them over Deadliest encampments. At night, the Deadliest woke up to find their armor dissolving on their bodies. And then there was Project Fenrir. deep, inside a mountain on Earth, in a laboratory that did not officially exist. Dr. Lena Schroeder had spent the last 90 days doing something that should have taken years. She had taken the sensor data from every engagement with the Deadliest, analyzed their shield frequencies and mapped their armor composition and built a weapon specifically designed to kill them. She called it the Godkiller Lance. It was a directed energy weapon that operated on a frequency perfectly tuned to pass through Deadliest's shield harmonics. It did not try to overpower the shields. It did not try to go around them. It simply passed through them as if they were not there. And then it hit whatever was behind them with enough focused energy to cut through Deadliest's capital ship armor like a hot wire through butter. When Dr. Schroeder demonstrated the weapon for the military command, she fired it at a captured piece of Deadliest hull plating from the wreckage of a destroyer. The beam punched through the plating, through the concrete wall behind it, through the rock behind that, and buried itself somewhere in the mountain. The room was silent. Our General Tanaka looked at the V in the wall and said, "How many can you build?" Dr. Schroeder said, "How many do you need?" The answer was all of them. Admiral Joaquin Reyes was given command of Operation Harrow, the first major human counterattack. His target was the threshold system where Sergeant Herrera's guerrilla campaign had already weakened the Deadliest garrison to the breaking point. Reyes was an old sailor, calm and steady, with a voice like gravel and a mind like a trap. He had spent the first 90 days of the war watching other officers lose their ships and their people, and he had sworn a quiet oath that when his turn came, he would make it count. His fleet was half the size of the Deadliest Defense Force in the threshold system. This did not bother him. He had Godkiller Lances mounted on every ship, and then he had a plan that the Deadliest would never see coming. The Battle of Threshold lasted 72 hours. Reyes jumped his fleet into the system in 3 waves, hitting the Deadliest from 3 different directions at once. The first wave drew the Deadliest fleet out of formation. The second wave hit their flanks with Godkiller Lances, punching through shields and armor and tearing capital ships apart from the inside. Third wave did something that the conquered later called the most insane tactical decision in recorded military history. They boarded the Deadliest ships. Human Marines in powered armor suits launched themselves across the void between ships on maneuvering thrusters latched onto Deadliest hulls with magnetic clamps, cut through airlocks with plasma torches, and fought their way inside. The Deadliest had never been boarded, not once in their entire military history. They had no protocols for it, no training for it, and no understanding of the kind of species that would willingly throw itself into the belly of an enemy warship in the middle of a battle. The fighting inside the ships was close, brutal and ugly. Humans fought with rifles, with knives, with fists, and with whatever they could tear off the walls. A Deadliest soldier was bigger than a human, stronger than a human, and covered in natural armor. None of that mattered when a human Marine with nothing left to lose jammed an explosive charge into the gap between an armored plate and detonated it at point-blank range. The Deadliest broke, not all at once, but piece by piece, ship by ship. Their fleet scattered. Some tried to retreat, some surrendered, some fought to the last soldier. By the end of the 72 hours, the threshold system was free, and the Deadliest had lost over 100 warships. On the surface of Threshold, Sergeant Herrera watched the Deadliest transports flee into the sky and sat down heavily on a wreck. He had been fighting for 94 days without rest. He was thin, scarred, and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a Deadliest blade. When the first human soldiers from the relief force reached his position, he looked up at them and said, "What took you so long?" Far away on the Dominion flagship, Overlord Keth Von received the reports. From Threshold, he read them slowly. He read them again. Then he did something he had not done since the war began. He pulled out the cultural assessment of humanity that his intelligence officer had submitted on the first day. The one he had never read, he read it. Now it was short and useless, full of dismissive generalizations and incorrect assumptions. He threw it across the room. Then he asked for the battlefield recordings from the occupied worlds. He watched them all. He watched a human farmer on New Cambria, a woman missing her right arm from a Deadliest plasma round, strangling a Deadliest soldier with a piece of wire pulled from a vent. He watched children on Bridgewater setting fire to Deadliest supply warehouse while singing a song he could not understand. He watched a recording from Threshold of a human Marine bleeding from wounds that should have killed him, charging a Deadliest position with an empty rifle used as a club. The Marine was laughing. Kethevin turned off the screen. He sat alone in his command chamber for a long time, and then he called his intelligence officer and asked a single question: "What are they?" The intelligence officer did not have an answer. In the weeks that followed, a new word appeared in the Deadliest language. It spread through their military like a disease, whispered barracks and murmured in the corridors of warships. The word roughly translated to the endless. It was not a title of respect. It was not a compliment. It was the kind of word that soldiers used when they talked about something they did not understand and could not stop. It was a prayer, small, desperate prayer from a species that was beginning to realize, far too late, that they had picked a fight with something they could not beat. Not because the humans were stronger, not because they were smarter, not because their weapons were better, because they simply would not stop. No matter what you did to them, no matter how many you killed, no matter how many worlds you burned, they would not stop. They would bleed and break and die, and the ones left standing would pick up the weapons of the fallen and keep coming. And they would keep coming tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, forever and ever, until one side was victorious and the other was dust. The Deadliest had conquered 200 species by being the most relentless force in the galaxy. They had just met something more relentless than them, and they were afraid. 6 months into the war, the Galactic Conquered could no longer pretend it was not happening. For the first 3 months, the Conquered had treated the human Deadliest conflict the way it treated all conflicts involving minor species. They filed reports, expressed concern, and quietly waited for the inevitable conclusion. Some delegates had already begun discussing how to divide human colonial territories after the surrender. One species had even submitted a formal claim on Earth's solar system, arguing that once humanity was subjugated, their home world would be open for resource Extraction, that claim was quietly withdrawn after the Battle of Threshold. Ambassador Idris Akefer had spent 6 months sitting in the conquered chamber, listening to 4,000 species talk about his people as if they were already dead. He had not argued, he had not begged, he had simply sat in his chair, taken notes and waited. Now, with the Deadliest in full retreat, and human fleets pushing into Dominion territory, the mood in the chamber had changed. The delegates were no longer pitying when they were nervous. An emergency session was called, and for the first time since the war began, the chamber was completely full. Every species was present, every seat was taken. The topic was not the Deadliest, the topic was humanity. Scholar Tal Nari was summoned to present his findings. Tal Nari had spent the last 6 months in his laboratory, buried under mountains of data, research, and historical records. He had not slept properly since the war began. His coral-like body had taken on a grayish tint that his species associated with extreme stress, and his hand shook slightly as he approached the speaking platform. He had been asked to provide the conquered with a full analysis of humanity as a species. He had done so. He wished he had not. He stood at the platform and looked out at the assembled delegates, thousands of eyes, sensors, quakering optical organs, stared back at him. He took a breath and began. I have studied over 3,000 species. During my career, he said, I have cataloged their behaviors, their capabilities, and their potential threats to the galactic community. In all that time, I have never encountered anything like the humans. He brought up his first display. It showed a diagram of human biology. Physically, humans are unremarkable. They are medium-sized, lack natural armor, lack claws, lack venom. Their senses are average, their strength is modest. On paper, they should not be a threat to any species in this chamber. He paused. This assessment is dangerously wrong. He changed the display. It now showed a map of Earth with migration patterns overlaid. Humans evolved on a single planet with extreme environmental variation. Deserts, ice fields, my jungles, mountains, oceans. They did not specialize for any single environment. Instead, they adapted to all of them. There is no climate on their world where humans cannot survive. They live in places that would kill most species in this room within hours. He changed the display again. This one showed a running human next to various prey animals. They are persistent predators. Their ancestors did not hunt by ambush or by speed. They hunted by following their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. A human cannot outrun a deer, but a human can keep walking, keep jogging, keep moving long after the deer has overheated and fallen. They do not need to be faster. They only need to not stop. The chamber was quiet. Their biology supports this. They sweat, and which allows them to regulate body temperature more efficiently than almost any other land animal on their planet. They can function on minimal sleep. They can eat almost anything organic. They can continue operating with injuries that would incapacitate or kill most species. They have been documented walking on broken bones, fighting with missing limbs, and remaining conscious and functional after blood loss that should render them comatose. He changed the display to a timeline of human wars. It filled the screen. It filled several screens. Their history is an almost unbroken record of conflict. They have been fighting each other for as long as they have existed. They have fought wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion, national pride, and in some cases reasons that even they cannot fully articulate, and the scale of these conflicts is difficult to comprehend. He highlighted several points on the timeline. In a single conflict they call the Second World War, they lost approximately 70 to 85 million individuals. This was roughly 3% of their total population at the time. The war lasted 6 years. They did not stop. They increased production of weapons, fielded larger armies, developed entirely new technologies, including weapons capable of destroying cities in a single detonation, and they fought until one side was completely defeated. A murmur ran through the chamber. Tylenari waited for it to fade. After that war, they built more of those city-destroying weapons. They built enough to destroy their entire planet. Several times over, two rival factions pointed these weapons at each other for decades. Not neither side fired. They simply waited, each one ready to end their own species if the other made the first move. The murmur became a low roar. Several delegates were speaking to each other in urgent whispers. A few were already heading for the exits. Tylenori raised his hand for silence. He was not finished. But the most relevant finding for this chamber is not their capacity for violence. It is their capacity for spite. The chamber went very quiet. Humans will harm themselves to harm an enemy. They will sacrifice resources, strategic advantages, and their own lives, not for tactical gain, but purely to ensure that an opponent suffers. No other species in our records demonstrates this behavior at a civilizational level. Most species surrender when the cost of fighting exceeds the potential benefit. See, humans do not perform this calculation. When sufficiently angered, they will burn their own house down if it means their enemy burns with it. He paused again and looked directly at the assembled delegates. They also form emotional bonds with abstract concepts and will die to protect them. A flag, a song, a memory, a patch of ground where something important once happened. They will fight and die for things that have no material value, because the value they assign to these things is not material, it is emotional, and to a human, emotional value is real value. He changed the display one final time. It showed a graph of Deadliest technology versus human technology over the 6 months of the war. In 6 months, humans have reverse-engineered Deadliest shield, harmonics weapon systems, and propulsion technology, like technologies that took the Deadliest centuries to develop. Humans did it in months, not because they are more intelligent, because they are more motivated. When a human has a reason to solve a problem, they will throw every resource they have at it until the problem is solved, or they are dead. There is no middle ground. He stepped back from the display. Members of the conquered, I will be direct. This species is not what we thought they were. They are not a minor civilization to be pitied or ignored. They are the single most dangerous species any of us have ever encountered. Not because of what they can do now, but because of what they will become. They learn faster than any species I have studied. They adapt faster, they scale faster, and they are very, very angry. He gathered his notes. I recommend that every species in this chamber begin treating humanity with the Same caution and respect they would afford a Tier 1 civilization, because within our lifetimes, that is exactly what they will be, whether we like it or not. He left the platform. The chamber erupted. The debate lasted 3 days. Species that had never spoken to each other found themselves in heated arguments. The Deadliest vassal species, who had been forced to sit in the back rows of the chamber for centuries, suddenly found themselves being courted by every major power. Everyone wanted to know what the Deadliest were planning. Everyone wanted to know what the humans would do next. During those 3 days, several things happened in rapid succession. First, 14 conquered species quietly opened diplomatic back channels with Earth. They sent private messages to Ambassador Akefer expressing interest in trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchange. Akefer received them all, responded politely to each one, and noted which species had been the first to suggest humanity should surrender. Second, a block of 6 species proposed preemptive sanctions against humanity, arguing that any species this dangerous should be contained before they became uncontrollable. The proposal was tabled when someone pointed out that sanctioning a species currently winning a war against the galaxy's most feared military empire might not be the smartest strategic decision. Third, and most importantly, Overlord Cathavian made a desperate move. The Deadliest Dominion had over 200 vassal species under its control. These were species that had been conquered, broken, and forced to serve the Dominion for generations. They provided labor, resources, and in some cases, soldiers for the Deadliest war machine. Cathavian ordered these vassal species to mobilize their forces and form a buffer between the Deadliest homeworlds and the advancing human fleets. He was using them as a shield. Humanity's response was elegant and ruthless. Instead of fighting through the vassal fleets, human ships broadcast a message on all frequencies in every language they could translate. People of the vassal worlds, you did not choose this war. You do not have to fight it. Stand down and you will not be harmed. Rise up and you will be free. Humanity does not make war on the enslaved. We make war on the slavers. Within a week, 3 vassal species defected. Their fleets stood down. Their governments declared independence, and their people began tearing down Deadliest monuments with their bare hands. 2 more species followed within a month. The buffer Keth Von had built was collapsing like a wall made of sand. On the last day of the conquered debate, Ambassador Akefer was given the platform. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the chamber. He was tired. He had not slept much in 6 months. His suit was slightly wrinkled, and his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. 6 months ago, I stood in this chamber and asked for help. He said, you told me to surrender. You told me my species would be destroyed and that resistance was futile. You were wrong. He paused. I am not here to gloat. I am not here to threaten. I am here to tell you that humanity did not start this war, but we will finish it, and when it is over, we will remember. His eyes moved slowly across the chamber. We will remember who stood with us. We will remember who offered help when we needed it, and we will remember who sat in comfortable chairs and told us to lie down and die. He straightened his tie. We are not asking for your help now. We do not need it, but the galaxy is going to look very different when this is over, and every species in this room is Going to have to live in the galaxy we build. I suggest you think carefully about what kind of neighbors you want us to be. He stepped down. The vote came the next day. By a narrow margin, the Galactic conquered, imposed a full arms embargo on the Deadliest Dominion. It was the first time in conquered history that the body had taken direct action against one of its own major members. It was not enough to save the Deadliest. Nothing was at that point, but it was a signal sent not to the Dominion, but to humanity. The galaxy was watching. The galaxy was paying attention, and the galaxy was, for the first time in its long and ancient history, afraid of the small, stubborn, angry species from the unremarkable planet third from a yellow star. Afraid and fascinated, and just a little bit in awe. 1 year after the destruction of Alara 7, the human fleet entered the Krath system. Captain Rana Vasquez stood on the bridge of the battle cruiser Alara's Memory and watched the stars shift as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Through the viewport she could see Krath Prime, the throne world of the Deadliest Dominion. It was a large planet, dark and angular, with cities that spread across its surface like veins of metal. She tried. Orbital stations circled it in rings. Defense platforms floated in fixed positions, their weapons pointed outward at the void. This was the heart of the empire that had killed 6,000 of her people. This was where it had all started, where Overlord Ket Ban had given the order to destroy Alara 7. This was where it would end. Vasquez had changed in the last year. She was thinner, there were new lines around her eyes and gray streaks in her hair that had not been there before. She moved differently now, with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned to carry heavy things without letting them show. She had fought in 7 engagements. Since Alara 7, she had lost friends, crewmates, and parts of herself that she would never get back. She had also been promoted 3 times. Her first ship, the battered frigate Perseverance, we were still in service, patched and repaired so many times that there was probably not a single original plate left on its hull. She had transferred to the Alara's Memory 6 months ago when the shipyards finished building it. She had named it herself. Behind her, the fleet spread out across the system. 240 human warships, plus another 60 from the 3 vassal species that had defected from the Dominion and joined humanity's cause. The largest human fleet ever assembled, armed with god-killer lances and weapons that had not existed a year ago. It was not the biggest fleet in galactic history. It was not the most powerful by raw numbers. But ship for ship, gun for gun, it was the most dangerous thing the galaxy had ever seen, because every single person in it had a reason to fight, and none of them were planning to stop. And General Tanaka's voice came through on the command channel from Earth. She was calm, as always, but there was something underneath the calm that Vasquez recognized. It was the sound of someone who had carried a weight for a very long time and was about to set it down. All units, this is General Tanaka. Operation Requiem is authorized. Proceed to engagement positions. Rules of engagement are in effect. Military targets only. Civilian infrastructure is not to be harmed. I repeat, civilian infrastructure is not to be harmed. We are not them. She paused. Good hunting. Tanaka out. The Deadliest home fleet was waiting for them. It was smaller than it should have been. A year of war had ground it down. Hit-and-run raids, the guerrilla campaigns, the lost supply depots, the defecting vassal species, and the steady advance of human forces through Dominion territory had taken their toll. Where there had once been thousands of warships, there were now hundreds. Where there had once been confident, disciplined crews, there were now exhausted soldiers who flinched at shadows and whispered about the endless. But they were still Deadliest, and they were defending their home, and they fought with the desperation of a species that knew what was coming. The battle began at 6:00 system time. Vasquez led the vanguard, the first wave of ships to engage the Deadliest defensive line. The Alara's memory surged forward, its godkiller lance firing in steady pulses that cut through Deadliest shields like they were made of paper. Around her, human ships moved in coordinated patterns that would have been impossible a year ago, but weaving between enemy fire with a precision born from 12 months of constant combat. The Deadliest fought hard, their orbital platforms poured fire into the advancing fleet, and their remaining capital ships formed a wall between the human fleet and Careth Prime. Vasquez lost 2 ships in the first hour, then 3 more in the second. She felt each loss like a punch to the stomach, but she did not slow down, and she did not stop. On the bridge of her ship she was quiet. She did not shout orders or slam her fists on consoles. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, directing her ships with the precision of a surgeon. When a Deadliest destroyer broke through the line and headed straight for the Alara's memory, she turned the ship to meet it head-on, fired the godkiller lance at point-blank range, and then flew through the expanding debris cloud. Without changing expression, in her head she was saying names. She had memorized them all 6,000, every man, woman, and child who had died on Alara 7's orbital station 1 year ago. She had downloaded the casualty list on the day it was published and spent the following month reading every name until she knew them by heart. It was not a healthy thing to do. She knew that. She did it anyway because someone had to remember them, and she had been there when they died, and that made it her responsibility. She said their names now silently, one by one, as Deadliest ships burned around her. The battle lasted 8 hours. By the end, the Deadliest home fleet was shattered. 40% of their ships were destroyed. Another 30% had surrendered or been disabled. The rest had scattered into deep space, running for the edges of the system with human ships in pursuit. The orbital platforms were silent. Some had been destroyed. Others had been boarded by human marines who fought through the quarters with the same brutal efficiency they had shown at Threshold. The marines took prisoners when they could. They did not take them gently, but they took them alive. The path to Careth Prime was open. Overlord Cathavan stood in his throne room and watched the battle through holographic display. The room was large and dark, built from the black stone that the Deadliest favored, and it was full of the bodies of his loyalists. The mutiny had started 3 hours ago. Half his officer corps had tried to arrest him and offer surrender to the humans. The other half had defended him. The fighting had been brief and vicious, and when it was over, Cathavan was still alive, and most of his officers were not. He stood alone, now surrounded by the dead, watching the last of his fleet die. On the display, he was old for Deadliest. His chitin was cracked in places, and his movements were slower than they had been a year ago. The war had aged him, not the fighting. The understanding, somewhere in the last 12 months, he had realized what he had done, what he had set in motion, and the knowledge had settled into his bones. Like poison, he had conquered 200 species. He had broken worlds and enslaved civilizations. He had never once doubted that he was the strongest force in the galaxy. He had been wrong. Harry, he stared at the display and watched a human battle cruiser cut through his last defensive line like it was not even there. And he understood with perfect and terrible clarity that this was the end, not just of the war, of the dominion of everything his species had built over centuries of conquest. It was all going to fall, not because the humans were monsters, but because they were something worse than monsters. They were patient, they were persistent, and they remembered everything. A communication signal lit up on every frequency. It was not a threat. It was not a demand for surrender. It was something Keith Vaughn had never heard from an enemy before. It was an offer. Ambassador Idris Agafar's voice filled the throne room. It was calm and steady, the same voice that had addressed the conquered 6 months ago, with the same voice that had said, humanity will handle this internally. But the words were different now. People of the Deadliest Dominion, this war is over. We have the power to destroy your civilization entirely. We will not. Humanity does not seek your extinction. We seek your surrender, accountability for those who ordered the murder of our people, and a lasting peace. You will not be enslaved. You will not be subjugated. We are not. The message repeated and repeated again. Across the Karath system, Deadliest soldiers heard it and stopped fighting. Not all of them, but enough. Keith Vaughn listened to the message 3 times. He stood very still. The bodies of his officers lay around him. The display showed his empire crumbling. The human fleet hung in orbit above his world, close enough to burn it to glass. And they were offering mercy. He did not understand. He had killed their people. He had burned their worlds. He had dismissed them as vermin and tried to grind them into dust. And now, with total victory in their hands, they were offering him the one thing he would never have offered them: a choice. He could face a tribunal. He could stand before his enemies and be judged for what he had done. Or he could die here in his throne room, surrounded by the dead, and be remembered as the last overlord of a fallen empire. He stood there for a long time. The display flickered. The human fleet waited. Then Keith Vaughn, overlord of the Deadliest Dominion, conqueror of 200 worlds, the most feared military commander in the galaxy, did something he had never done in his entire life. He surrendered. The aftermath was quiet and complicated, arduous and painful. The Deadliest Dominion was dismantled, not destroyed. Dismantled. Their military was reduced. Their vassal species were freed. Their conquests were reversed one by one, world by world. Keith Vaughn was tried before an international tribunal that included representatives from 12 species, including 3 that the Deadliest had formerly enslaved. Trial lasted 4 months. He was found guilty of crimes against sentient life and sentenced to imprisonment, not death. Imprisonment. The galaxy watched all of this with a mixture of confusion and love. They had expected genocide. Every species in the conquered had seen what humanity was capable of, had heard Tilnery's presentation about their capacity for violence and spite and total war. They had seen the fury. They had expected the fury to consume everything. Instead, and humanity offered mercy, not weak mercy, not the mercy of a species that could not finish what it started. It was the mercy of a species that could have destroyed everything and chose not to. It was mercy with teeth, mercy backed by the certainty that if anyone mistook it for weakness, the teeth would come out. Again, the Galactic Concord held a formal vote to elevate humanity to Tier 1 civilization status. The vote was unanimous, not because every species agreed. Some were terrified of humanity, some resented them, some still thought they should be contained, but nobody voted against them because nobody wanted to be the species that said no to the people who had just dismantled the most powerful military empire in the galaxy and then decided to be kind about it. Ambassador Acuffer accepted the elevation with a short speech, and he thanked the conquered. He acknowledged the losses on all sides. He did not gloat and he did not threaten. He did clear his throat, say one thing that was remembered for a very long time. We did not fight this war to become what we destroyed. We fought it so that no one would have to fight it again. Scholar Tylan Ori published his final paper on humanity. It was the most read academic document in conquered history. Species that had never heard of Earth downloaded it and studied it. Military academies across the galaxy made it required reading. Diplomatic schools taught it as a case study. The paper's conclusion was simple. They are not the strongest species. They are not the fastest, the most numerous, or the most ancient, but they possess something no other species in our records has demonstrated to the same degree: the ability to be both the most terrifying force in the galaxy and then choose in their moment of absolute power to be kind. This is why they are dangerous. This is why they will endure, not because they can destroy everything, but because they can destroy everything and choose not to. Captain Rene Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Alara's memory and looked down at Kareth Prime. The planet was intact, its cities were standing, its people were alive. The orbital station still circled it, though their weapons were cold and quiet. Now, smoke rose from a few places where the fighting had been heaviest, but the fires were being put out and the wounded were being treated and the dead were being counted and named on both sides. As Vasquez was tired, she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. She had been fighting for a year, and the year had taken things from her that she would never get back. She could still say all 6,000 names from Alara 7. She would always be able to say them. That was the price she had paid, and she would carry it for the rest of her life. Her first officer, a young woman named Tors, stood beside her and looked out at the planet below. Tors had joined the crew 6 months ago, fresh from the academy, and she had aged 10 years in that time. She looked at Vasquez with the expression of someone searching for an answer to a question she did not know how to ask. Was it worth it, Captain? She said. Vasquez did not answer right away. She looked at Kareth Prime. She thought about Alara 7 and the people she had not been able to save. She thought about Sergeant Herrera, who had lost 2 fingers and gained a legend. She thought about General Tanaka, who had carried the weight of a species on her shoulders and never once let it show. She thought about Dr. Schroeder, who had built a weapon that could kill gods and then gone back to her lab to build something else. She thought about Ambassador Akefer, who had told the galaxy to go to hell and then offered peace to the enemy. She thought about all the people who had fought and bled and died, and she thought about the planet below, still standing, still alive, because humanity had chosen to let it stand. Ask me in 100 years, she said. She gave the order to stand down. Weapons went cold. The fleet held position. Below them, Sekarath Prime turned slowly in the light of its star. Battered and broken, but not destroyed. The war was over, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again.